Good afternoon. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement. The Lower Pecos Canyonlands is the ancestral home of many indigenous peoples. This includes groups whose names have been lost to time, colonization, displacement, migration, and settlement. We acknowledge the ancestral peoples who created this painted landscape, and we strive to honor both past and living indigenous peoples and their cultural heritage. So thank you for joining us on this beautiful spring day, depending, of course, where you are in the world. And welcome to this series of Lunch and Learn presentations that share the latest results of our research on Pecos River style art. I want to start by giving you some background information on the Hearthstone Project. So the Hearthstone Project is a collaboration between Texas State University and Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center, partially funded by the National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, with additional funding by individual donors like you and by other funding institutions. The concept of el núcleo duro, or the hard nucleus, lies at the heart of the discussion about time depth in belief systems. El núcleo duro is a term coined by Alfredo Lopez Austin. It refers to an ancient, complex, and widely shared cosmovision at the core of American religious traditions. Proponents of el núcleo duro argue that some elements of the core date to at least the Archaic period, but are perhaps as old as the earliest migrations into North America, long before the inception of agriculture and larger permanently settled populations. The Lower Pecos Canyonlands are the home of visual components of this core in Pecos River style rock art. The region is situated along the US-Mexico border and extends about 100 kilometers north and 140 kilometers south of the Rio Grande. We have recorded over 250 PRS panels, varying in size from a few figures to large murals composed of several hundred figures. Thanks to 42 new radiocarbon dates, which Karen will be discussing in a couple of months, we believe that Pecos River style was produced between 5,500 years and 1,350 years ago. So all dates presented that I talk about here are given in calibrated years before present, or calendar years. So about 13 years ago, based on an analysis of the White Shaman site and insight from Huichol Shaman, Boyd formulated a set of statements. She took this work to Alfredo Lopez Austin in 2016, and he supported her assertions. Taken as a whole, they suggest that the archaic core set of beliefs and symbols is depicted in Pecos River style art. So what we did was we knew that the function of Pecos River style and the depth of its involvement in the archaic core would only become clear if we expanded our analysis beyond the White Shaman mural to include the broader corpus of Pecos River style art. We needed a larger sample of sites with data gathered using a consistent protocol and more observations from shamans and elders. So we turned those statements into hypotheses, as you see on your screen, to see if systematic observations made at other sites and by other people support them. Thus was born the Hearthstone Project. Carolyn Boyd, Karen Steelman, and I were awarded 2 grants, one from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the other from the National Science Foundation to fund this initiative. Our interdisciplinary research utilizes methods from the fields of archaeology, chemistry, iconography, ethnology, and art history to glean information from Pecos River style art. To address these hypotheses, we ask questions that you see on the screen. The first 3 questions apply to the National Endowment for Humanities Research, and the second set to the National Science Foundation Research. We needed to analyze many murals using a consistent research protocol to determine if there are more compositions and to see if the artist used consistent rules of paint application, also to see if recurring motifs are recognizable to modern indigenous societies. So chronology guides the National Science Foundation research. We were looking for the oldest and youngest murals in the region. We already suspected tremendous time depth, but we wanted to detect temporal variation in the use of specific motifs or methods of paint application. We also wanted to sync the art with the rest of the archaeological and climate record. So this Lunch and Learn series focuses on the methods we are using to answer these questions and our preliminary results. I suggest that after this session, you navigate to the Shumla Education menu and sign up for the next 4 months. But I open this series by describing some of the other aspects of the archaeological record. So let's get started. About 5,500 years ago, in the semi-arid canyonlands of southwest Texas and Coahuila, hunter-gatherer groups started producing Pecos River style art. Many of these murals are massive and complex. Today, I will briefly review what we currently understand about timing, the conditions under which it was produced, and the nature of the society that produced it. I'll begin by introducing you to the landscape. It's an area in southwest Texas and northern Coahuila, Mexico, located at the eastern edge of the Chihuahuan Desert. So the Chihuahuan Desert is right over in this area. Edwards Plateau over here. And to the north, you have the Southern Plains. 3 rivers, the Pecos, the Devils, and the Rio Grande, join in this region. Please notice the density of dots. Each of those represents a rock art site. Shumla's Alexandria project documented over 250 of these, and we know of at least 30 in Mexico. There are dozens more submerged under Amistad Reservoir, and most of these are Pecos River style. It is perhaps the highest concentration of rock art in North America. But why, and why there? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the landscape. Europeans had a tough time with this country. Gaspar Castaño de Sosa and his entourage trying to reach New Mexico got lost here in 1590. They used up 25 dozen horseshoes in a few miles. 249 years later, not much had changed. W.H.C. Whiting and company were in search of an east-west route between San Antonio and El Paso. He left his impressions of the region in a journal. Here is Diana Rolón, working her way up Painted Canyon, just a few hundred meters from the Pecos River. And this is the bottom of a canyon. We were boulder hopping through dense brush, and it wasn't very friendly brush either. Here's another shot from over by in the Devil's River Basin, and you can see Tim Murphy and Audrey Lindsay for scale there. And this is the pathway to Halo Shelter. That's the ledge. This over here is the bottom of the canyon to the right. Lots of relief, rough country. So Europeans did not appreciate this country. It's certainly not conducive to farming. Again, from Whiting's journal, we find the country to consist of a vast table elevation. You got that right. Cut up by some great convulsion of old time into numerous ravines or canyons. However, viewed from another perspective, this is sacred landscape. At one time in the past, every wrinkle in this Google Earth image likely contained paint. The region still houses a spectacular body of art, painted over thousands of years. Pecos River style alone was produced over a period of 4,000 years. So by the time of our earliest Pecos River style dates, people had been living in this region for 7,000 years at least. They transitioned from hunting Pleistocene megafauna to smaller game. By the Middle Holocene, 5,500 years ago, which is this time period right in here, they were painting murals. Lower Pecos rock shelters in Texas and Coahuila contain some of the best preserved and longest records of hunter-gatherer lifeways in North America. From these excavations, we know that they produced basketry, sandals, nets, and mats from yucca, agave, sotol, and bear grass. They fashioned implements from wood and mapped elaborate stone tools. They were painted long before the earliest Pecos River style dates, because we have recovered painted pebbles from deposits a few thousand years older. We also know the people who produced the art were hunters, gatherers, and fishers. They baked agave and collected and processed prickly pear and mesquite bean pods. They hunted and trapped large and small game. An interesting and overlooked aspect of living off the land is fishing in this region. After all, there are three major rivers. In an analysis of faunal material from Hines Cave, Ken Lord estimated the meat weight from the bones he identified in the levels that were roughly contemporaneous with the earliest rock art sites. Fish accounted for 12.5% of the total meat weight. Chris Jurgens also noticed numerous cut marks consistent with filleting fish, and it's possible that they prepared it along with agave, mesquite flour for short-term storage. And Chris worked with the Arenosa Shelter collection. Recent Eagle Nest Canyon excavations have produced more macrobot data. They gathered plants, obviously, and likely tended agave plots. Kevin Hanselka and Leslie Bush and company have documented over 35 edible plant taxa and more fuelwood taxa from the recent excavations. Although maize cultivation was adopted to the west of the Trans-Pecos around 2,000 years ago, the people of the Lower Pecos did not farm. Now, I think this is a table from an upcoming publication in the Journal of Texas and Archaeology and History. It will be published in the Styles volume, and today is Jack's birthday, I think, so I just wanted to mention that. Let's move on to the Middle Holocene and the Jackrabbit and Jaguar shelter time period. So the earliest dates we get from this time period, okay? We can examine some data from this time, Middle Holocene, the time that the murals in Jackrabbit and Jaguar were painted. We will look at climate, population growth, residential mobility, how often people moved, how they organized their labor, and some technological changes. And I would like to point out here that I'm presenting everybody else's work. I'm going to try to name them as I go, but keep in mind that I am using the pronoun we loosely. So let's start at Arenosa Shelter near the mouth of the Pecos River, just meters from the Rio Grande. Here we have one of the first climate records obtained from the area. Notice first that OSHA was not in effect when this site was excavated. I just love these ladders. Also note the strange reverse grading of sediments and deposits that you see here. In an early assessment of climate, Von Bryant inferred gradual drying to arid conditions based on a geomorphic record of intermittent extreme flooding at this shelter. However, if we look north, south, east, and west, or at least north, east, and west, the local climate is roughly in phase with the adjacent regions. So we're looking at this time period right here. Now the red indicates warm, hot, dry, and getting drier. The green over here, around 3,000 and 4,000, indicates wetter climate. So we're concentrating on the earliest dates, this blue line to the left, at 5,500 years. So it was warm and dry and becoming drier. This is confirmed by pollen and plant macrofossil record from Hines Cave, an excavation supervised by Harry Schaefer and Von Bryant in the other millennium, the 1970s. All right, moving into a more fine-grained look at the climate. Recent work at Hull's Cave to the east on the Edwards Plateau has produced a well-dated record with multiple proxy climate data sets. And here I compare the Hull's Cave and the Lower Pecos records. The graph on the right side of the slide illustrates leaf wax data and carbon isotope ratios and hydrogen isotope ratios obtained from that leaf wax, suggesting drier conditions and minimal mesoscale convective or thunderstorms prevailed during the first half of the Holocene. So what I want to show you right here, in this area, prior to 5500, these lines stay low. These lines, this is 6,000 years. This is the hydrogen isotope beta that indicates whether there's large-scale thunderstorm activity. Those of us that live on the Edwards Plateau know that's where we get a lot of our rain from. Over here is the C3, C4 plant data. And this is showing a very strong signature, a C4 signature. So let me explain. Carbon isotope ratios tell us the photosynthetic pathway of the plants, and if they are drought-tolerant grasses or woody shrubs. Hydrogen isotope ratios tell us about the intensity or frequency of thunderstorm activity. And all of this is trapped in leaf wax, or the cuticle that covers plant leaves. So recovering that leaf wax, workers have found that during the early Holocene, drought-tolerant C4 summer grasses may have occupied nearly 90% of the landscape. And this was likely associated with significant reductions in evapotranspiration, hence rainfall. And so we're talking about some of this area leading up to the time right before the first rock art. But starting around 5500, right in this area, right here, there is a slight uptick in mesoscale convective storm activity, or the large-scale thunderstorms, the blue arrow, with intermittent flooding, and the carbon isotope record shifts slightly towards C3 plants. So these would be shifting away from drought-adapted to more shrubs and perhaps trees. So this coincides with a series of extreme floods on the Pecos River seen in the Arenosa shelter deposits. Apart from flooding, this may signal an occasional rise in moisture and an erratic climate regime. So moving on to looking at population. Previous writers had described the prehistoric inhabitants as living in densely populated enclaves along major rivers. But thanks to a decade of work by Texas State University archaeologists Steve Black, David Kilby, Charles Koenig, and many others associated with the Ancient Southwest Texas Project, much more data is becoming available. They are estimating relative population changes using summed probability distributions of large radiocarbon data sets. The idea is this: if you collect enough radiocarbon dates, and I mean hundreds of dates, and then you perform statistical magic on the data, they're summed probability distributions, then you have an idea of how many people were there at a given time, or at least the intensity of fuel wood use. Keep in mind that this is one indicator of energy use in a pre-industrial society. This SPD data was computed by Emily McQuistion. Looking at the 500-year moving average trend line, and that's a dotted line here, you see it remains very low for a long time. It ticks up a little bit around 7,000, and then it wavers, but it stays elevated until it drops over here around 3,000. But in this area right here, the blue vertical line marks our earliest radiocarbon dates on Pecos River style paint. It shows that production of that Pecos River style began during a relative rise in the trend line. However, we do need more dates, but it's just a little hint that something was going on here when we get our earliest dates. So turning to settlement patterns. We're looking at changes in residential mobility and labor organization. Turpin, Schaefer, and Brown argued for Turpin, Schaefer, and Brown argued for rock shelter residents and a shift from a forager to a collector economy. Using data from earth oven experiments, Deering argued for a greater residential mobility. Lately, Charles Koenig has designed much more sophisticated earth oven experiments yielding better information and achieved higher return rates with less fuel. He still argues for relatively high residential mobility, but he is also investigating the possibility of seasonal ritual gatherings around earth oven production. Testing settlement patterns. Did they all live on the rivers? Did they live away from the rivers? Charles Koenig and Steve Black tested these predictions with a study of settlement patterns. They attempted to answer the following questions. Is there a river-centered settlement pattern? Are these semi-sedentary canyon collectors, or are they nomadic canyonland foragers? They tested the data with a survey. Charles Koenig found that site density increases with distance from the river, so the data do not support a strictly river-centric settlement pattern. However, the survey areas were a little too small. They didn't extend far enough from the river to test the canyonland foragers hypothesis. All that land is privately owned there, or Charles would have run over there and checked it out. Moving along, measuring earth ovens. So Koenig and Black also found another way of looking at population pressure is to measure intensification of resources. They studied earth ovens, which were used to process agave and sotol, important in the diet and food getting technology of the region. The rock heating elements in these ovens break into smaller pieces after each use until they are too small to hold heat and are discarded. So think of your electric heating element, oven heating element, only substitute rock for that heating element. They would heat up the rock and use that as their source of heat, bury it underground so it didn't, the super hot rock didn't catch the food on fire. So the rock heating elements in these ovens break into smaller pieces after each use until they are too small to hold enough heat, and then they are discarded. So you see the large rock heating elements in the middle and a discard pile around the outside. So, around the perimeter. So, Koenig, Black, and many others excavated earth ovens in Eagle Cave spanning 9,000 years of occupation, collecting the fire-cracked rock discarded from the heating elements. They measured the density and the size of the fire-cracked rock. That's a monumental task. They reasoned that as population increases, the amount of discarded rock should also increase, expressed as rock density. That makes sense. More people, more ovens. A proxy data set for increasing resource pressure, and of course, more pressure on all your resources. Also, as pressure increases, people will start using smaller rocks instead of lugging in the larger replacements. Unfortunately, that decreases the thermal efficiency of the oven. Think of using your electric oven with just one heating element. So, what they found was that fire-cracked rock density peaks right around the mid-Holocene, between 6,000 and 5,000 years ago, in phase with a rising SPD trend line and general climate trends. Okay. However, the switch to keeping smaller, less efficient heating elements occurs later, between 4,500 and 4,000 years ago. That's the blue dashed line. Lagging behind peak firecracked rock density and during a slight drop or plateau in regional population trends. So this is a change from thermal to labor efficiency, because they reuse the same rocks as they break into smaller pieces. The authors of the study argue that this switch from thermal to labor efficiency might indicate short-term intensification or rapid reuse of ovens by seasonally aggregated groups. They suggest that this could be a signal for agave processing connected to ritual gatherings. This period is bracketed by a series of Pecos River style art dates from 5,000 to 4,700 BP. Thermal efficiency. Okay. Now, we move to dark point technology. At the end of the early Archaic, people were making broad-bladed and barbed martindale points and series and bell points, possibly associated with bison hunting, and then they switched to slender, shouldered, and alternately beveled pandale points, close to the earliest Pecos River style dates. Elton Pruitt tells me that the pandale point abruptly replaces earlier points by 5,600 BP. It is narrow and shouldered in contrast to the preceding points. Not only is the pandale type narrow and shouldered, it is alternately beveled to create a twisted effect that sometimes reaches as much as 90 degrees. Interestingly, the technological antecedents of the pandale point, these have not been identified in the archaeological records. And this is an abrupt technological change that could suggest that one or more new groups of people moved into the Lower Pecos region when bison were no longer present in significant numbers or were completely absent. Chronologically, the appearance of pandale points roughly coincides with the appearance of rock art murals on rock shelter walls. These technological changes may or may not imply a movement of people or change in subsistence. We're just not sure. However, they occur in a specific chronological sequence, and they do occur right around the time of the first Pecos River style art. So now it's time to move away from the earliest art and take a look at the late Archaic period or late Holocene. This is a time of massive change. So we're going to move away from the 5,000 year period and move over to this area right here, this time period around 3,000, 3,500 years ago. Okay. Keep in mind that we have obtained a succession of Pecos River style dates younger than 5,500 BP. But around 3,000 to 2,800, a rise in grass and arboreal pollen signals a brief transition to a wet period. Right here, you see the green popping up across the Edwards Plateau, the Lower Pecos, the Trans-Pecos. So this coincides with the presence of bison in bonfire shelter at 2,500 BP, and it's backed by geomorphic data from Arenosa shelter. And as I said, the wet period appears to be widespread in climate records from the Southern Plains, the Trans-Pecos, even Coahuila, and the Edwards Plateau. So let's take a finer, closer look at that through the Hall's Cave data. This is in phase with recently published data from Hall's Cave, which has multiple lines of evidence for a surge in thunderstorm activity, flooding, and a shift to C3 woody vegetation, signaling wetter conditions on the Edwards Plateau. Although the Mesic period is short, perhaps lasting 600 or so years, it ends around 2,400, after which the climate dries rapidly. So what I want you to look at right here is this abrupt rise in hydrogen isotope ratios and a C3-C4 ratio. And this signals, it's a pretty strong signal. And it coincides with Von Bryant's pollen data from the lower Pecos. So also Patton and Dibble's work. So what's going on there? What happens to the population? Well, it coincides with an actual drop in the SPD trend line. You can see this right here. Burning and radiocarbon dates, the number of radiocarbon dates and burning obviously drops and bottoms out around 2500. However, after 2500, at the end of the Mesic period, the trend line increases steadily to a peak that is more than double. So it drops and then it just skyrockets, more than double the previous high reading. And this rise is high enough to suggest that people were packing into the area and not moving far from the rivers, or perhaps as Koning and Black have suggested, they are congregating during certain seasons and engaging in large ceremonial activities. We now know that some of the larger Pecos River style murals were produced around this time. So it's interesting that we get this drop right here. Did people disperse away from the rivers? We just don't know. Or did they quit baking so much agave? We just need more data. We need to think it through. Okay, so we also had a lot of changes in dark point technology. A succession of point styles occurs. Near the start of the wetter period, the technology shifts from thin, short barbed Langtree, Valverde points to barbed and basal notched early Shumla points, and then to the larger barbed corner notched Castroville series points associated with bison hunting. Classic Shumla points occur with the Marcus points. After 2400, the corner to side notched Inzer series points are present in the deposits. All of this suggests relatively rapid change or perhaps disruption. Suggested that these points come off of the Edwards Plateau may be associated with the presence of bison. You know, the bison were there at least sporadically during this time period. So also, was Pecos River style produced during the Mesic period? We are not certain, and we need more precise dates for both the climate and the art. And we're getting the precise dates, and we kind of need more precise dates on the climate. So it's time to recap. I've only hit the high points, but here's what we know about conditions during the earliest known Pecos River style production in the Middle Archaic. The data support a first dry half of the Middle Holocene with a slight uptick in mesoscale convective storms during the last half. Could this signal an erratic bloom and bust climate? Regional population rises in a relative sense, but river-centric settlement patterns aren't supported. Survey results do not support either side of the forager-collector debate, but Charles Koning's recent experimental work suggests that a reorganization of labor would have greatly increased return rates for earth oven cooking. So why wouldn't they have done it, right? The earliest Pecos River style dates correspond to a rise in the SPD trend line, a peak in firecracked rock density from earth ovens, but a change in firecracked rock morphology, which signifies a switch to labor efficiency that occurs later around 4,800 to 4,400 years ago. So does this indicate short-term seasonal intensification associated with ritual? And we know that the Pecos River style art, especially the large murals, this is public art. It was painted for a crowd. So very different from some of the Vision Quest stuff that you see in other places. So finally, let's review it in the late Archaic, a time of rapid climate, subsistence, and cultural change. There is a much wetter climate from about 3,200 to 2,400 years ago. We have bison present, maybe not in great numbers and probably not continuously, but they're there. The SPD trend line drops. So we get less burning in the rock shelters around the rivers. Large points associated with bison hunting were recovered from the deposits. These conditions signal something: movement, disruption, rapid subsistence change, and the possibility of contact between two different cultures living in the same region. After 2,400, the climate dries rapidly. The SPD trim line rises to a much higher level, and we see another technological shift to Inzer and Trio points. And surprise, Pecos River style is produced during this later period on into around 1350 or 1400 years ago. So finally, we have some bigger questions. To what degree is the lower Pecos Canyonland region linked to adjacent areas? Some authors have viewed the LPC as isolated and conservative. Is it isolated and conservative? But we think we can use an increased understanding of Pecos River style and its context to look beyond the region. How did information flow between the LPC and other regions, including Mesoamerica? Many authors cite similarities in archaic period lithic and textile technology of the LPC in northern Mexico. And we now know the iconography has links to Mesoamerican symbolism. So is Pecos River style the product of an isolated culture? Or is it a local manifestation of widely shared belief system and archaic core? The people of the lower Pecos were highly skilled hunters, gatherers, fishers, weavers, flint knappers, and painters. They had a deep and reverent understanding of the landscape, and we are just beginning to learn about them. Stay tuned.
That was an amazing sort of synthesis of the climate and different technologies. It's great to see the rock art put in context. For the viewers, if you have a question, if you want to put it in the chat box, feel free to do that. And we'll do those first, and then we'll open it up at the end. Somebody had asked about your Arenosa slide earlier. So if you're still sharing, Phil, you might, I don't know if they wanted to see that slide of Arenosa again.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm flipping through the slides now.
Yeah, it was fairly early on, I think.
Yep, it's around slide 11. There we go. So there's Arenosa.
And amazing.
It's a river terrace site on the Pecos River that was underneath Amistad Reservoir until it dried up. I hear it's exposed again. I'm not sure how much silt or if any silt is on it. But these are slack water deposits, meaning, well, they're both. It was catching floods from the Pecos River, and then when the Rio Grande flooded, because it was so close to the mouth of the Rio Grande, it would catch slack water that backed up into the Pecos River. And then, of course, when the water stops, it drops its sediment load. And what happened was the really intense storms upstream on the Pecos would come crashing into the Rio Grande and slow down and drop all those big clasts that you see, or some of those big clasts that you see in the picture, like this thing right here. All right, and I'm not a geomorphologist, and Charles Frederick's probably going to call me up and yell at me in a little bit, but this is what I know. Setting the scene for that is that when you have the junction of two rivers and they collide, that's when you're flooding, the water slows down and drops those lovely, as you see, layers of sediment. And so as they accumulated, people would live on them. And then, another flood would come along and you get another layer and people would live on them again. And you get this time separated pieces of human life, sort of like snapshots, uh, building up in a record in that river terrace. I don't know if that's what they wanted to know, but
I think that's great. Um, Next question is, which, if any, tribal nations claim heritage in this region?
well, um, I believe that we have the Park Service has sent letters to the Comanche, the Apache, the Kickapoo, um, I think Lipan. I'm, and to name a few, but they've sent letters out to at least those tribal groups, uh, Mescalero, uh, Mescalero Apache, and those are the ones I'm aware of at the moment.
Yeah.
Can you add to that, Karen?
The other group is the Kiowa.
Absolutely, the
Yeah.
Kiowa.
But I mean, I would say that that there was also the sort of what we often call native Texans that lived in the area before those groups came into the area that may have been absorbed into other groups as stresses.
A lot of this, yes. I mean, those are the ones that we also, of course, are pretty sure that the Coehuiltecan groups were moving in through this area, living in this area, and they were certainly to the east. And so a variety of small Coehuiltecan bands probably passed through this area and lived there and claimed, and understandably, um, um, you know, that their ancestors are there.
Right.
So absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Phil. So the next question is, are earth ovens strictly found at rock art sites, or were samples found in areas surrounding the canyons? Are we assuming that the beginning of rock art symbolizes the first sedentary population in the area? So there's sort of two questions there.
Okay, to answer the first question, I don't I don't think they could be absolutely sedentary. I think that they were moving through the area uh, based on the fact that they would be using up resources fairly quickly. So you wouldn't probably have absolutely sedentary populations. How long they stayed there is a matter of debate. Um, I feel like they had to pick up and move seasonally or at least annually because they would hunt out and fish out and bake out the area and then have to at least move on. And what was the first part of the question?
Um, it was asking about earth ovens and if they are only found at rock art sites or are they found in surrounding areas?
Yes, they're found everywhere. I say everywhere. They're usually found near sources of wood, rock, and lechuguilla. The exception is inside the rock shelters, which you had to lug them into the rock shelters, all of that into the rock shelters um, to actually build the ovens. So they would usually be located, if you were out there along the landscape, at the tips of the wrinkles that you saw on the Google Earth map, at the header canyons, the canyons, and also down on river terraces where wood and some water and rock was available. So there is some patterning there, but they are not limited to rock shelters or even areas in front of rock shelters.
Okay. Margaret Berry says, very interesting. And then she says, thank you. And she has a comment. She says, it's interesting that the PRS Pecos River style seems to dwindle out at the same time. That's the start of new iconography in far west Texas and southern New Mexico. And so I didn't know if you wanted to comment.
Oh, sure. Yes, it is interesting. Next question. Okay.
Um,
I might let my wife field that question. But no, seriously. Um, it's interesting that to me, that it lasts until 1350 or 1400. And I'm using these dates these are loose dates, but it just, that's right up, it bumps right up against some big happenings down in Mesoamerica. And you just wonder what's going on. So I guess the answer to your question is, I just wonder what's going on, Margaret.
and then next question is, would it be possible to attribute changing projectile point technology to fads and trends? And said that, what is your thoughts? And wondered if Elton has any thoughts on that.
Yes, of course, I'm commenting on other people's work here and other people's interpretations. And I try to balance between the idea that these are people moving around and subsistence, bases changing. That is, if you don't have any big game out there, are you still going to be building giant points? I think it's probably a combination of all three. Technology, the theory of technology change is, pretty controversial. Um, I I do believe, though, that in a society where you really do have your subsistence base locked in, if a bunch of bison come charging into the area, you're going to go after the meat, and you might have to change something up, your methods up, to actually go after that meat. How exactly you do that, and if other people followed them in, that just makes for an interesting mix of, society and technology. And how does that shake out? It could be just fads and trends in some cases, but I think um, a lot of it was driven by um, their need and their want to live off the land as efficiently and skillfully as possible. And so I think that they would be responding to external changes of some kind then, and there might be some internal stuff going on, but I think in some cases we're talking about adapting,
Yeah.
being the most best practices, being the most skilled hunter that you can be. So anyway, that's
Okay, next question is it possible that there was a mother culture here that seeded the Mesoamerican cultures that came later?
um, that there was another culture here, that
A mother culture, like
a mother culture. Oh, you mean that then moved south? And
I think that's what they're saying, yeah.
it's possible. Um, I don't know if I don't know if we have the data we have enough information to prove that there is some kind of a connection. That connection could be like Lopez Austin argued, is a shared ancient core of beliefs, and that information flowed between them from the South. So otherwise, I couldn't really, it's possible, but I can't really comment on it. But I think it's really interesting to think about all these groups having shared belief system. And then what else did they share? You know, how far did that go? And did some people move south? And what's going on at Teotihuacan? Somebody needs to pick up that and run with it.
Okay.
Okay.
Last question on the chats is tangentially related. The Science Advances Journal last month reported on cave art found in a large cave in Patagonia. It was dated to the early Holocene period, around 8,200 years old. The few pictures that were published show some similarities to our lower Pecos area. So there's not a question, but I mean, I know you and I have talked about this paper, so I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, I haven't really seen the art that much. We've discussed the nature of those dates and whether or not they're really, or how many of those dates there are. I know we've got how many do we have now? 42?
I think it's almost like 47.
47 now. Yeah, okay, so we're up to 47. I believe I'd want to see more dates from that area before I actually believed that it was that old. Am I?
Yeah, I mean, there were 3 dates published in that paper on very small samples, but they are exciting results, I would say. And
Exciting result.
they have the there's that one picture in the article that has the sort of pipette or single pole ladder kind of shape, which is really interesting.
Well, that one could be that could be ancient.
Mhm.
That symbol, and it could have come right through here, and it could have, and it could show up at 8,000 years in Patagonia. Um, these are ideas, and once again, that kind of ties in with an archaic core, a really ancient core, and it would be the single pole ladder. I may be corrected by somebody downstairs, but I think the single pole ladder is very ancient. So
Let's just say stay tuned for the upcoming presentation to learn more about the single pole ladder.
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. All right.
Well, there are no more questions in the chat. If anyone wants to verbally ask a question, they can unmute themselves.
Do we have evidence of people moving through pre-rock art then? Just to clarify.
Moving through where?
The area, the Lower Pecos area.
Moving through the lower Pecos area. You mean
Before,
passing through?
I think
Yes.
seeing if there are people, what's the archaeological evidence before the rock art appears?
Lots of people. Is that what you mean? The people were in the
Yes.
area?
So
I
we're
think-
thinking that the people that placed the rock art were not the earliest inhabitants
Oh, no,
of said area.
they were not. We absolutely, we had, there is a component at the bottom of Eagle Cave excavated by Charles Koenig and Steve Black and company, Kilby and others, that uncovered a bison antiquus, which is it's at around 11,000, no, 12,500, I think. And that shows evidence of butchering an extinct bison. And then Bonfire Shelter has evidence of extinct bison, and it's pretty obvious that they were butchered and the humans were involved with that. So you're looking at 12,500 years of human occupation in that area. And then it's just continuous after that. It just goes straight through the area. We've got a lot of dates over 9,000, well over 9,000 from several sites, including Hines Cave, Eagle Cave, and so forth. So the people were in that area for 7,000 years at least before, plus they were producing painted pebbles. So we know they were painting before the Pecos River style art went up on the wall. And I believe Karen, when she gives her talk, she's going to talk about the life of the canvas or the cave wall itself and how long it might have lasted and how that ties into some of our dates, our earliest dates. Right, Karen?
Yeah, I just say that the oldest dates we have are the oldest surviving rock art dates. Doesn't mean that there wasn't rock art that hasn't survived. But I'll be talking a little bit about how we know how old the wall surfaces are when I give my talk. But they are young geologically. There's a lot of spalling and fracturing of these sites. And so these walls don't last on a geological time scale that long. And so there may be rock art that was produced that we just don't have anymore.
There you go.
Bill,
Yep.
this is Elton.
Hi, Elton.
Could I point out that while it may be somewhat controversial, that at Cueva Quebrada, we had burn and cut mark on extinct horse bone dating to somewhere between 14,000 and 14,005.
Yes,
So
yes.
people have been in the lower Pecos for a long time. And I'll agree with you on the painted pebbles. The earliest style of painted pebble painted somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 cal BP. And then there's a break, and then you get the late Archaic painted pebble sequence. It starts with the Langtree Valverde series of points and going later.
Cool. That's really interesting. And Elton has spent hundreds of hours documenting painted pebbles. So we look forward to hearing from him someday about painted pebbles. Right, Elton?
Sure, why not?
It's disappeared from the screen. I don't know.
Well,
There he
Teresa,
is.
Teresa's the one doing the talking, you know.
No.
That's great. So this has been fun.
Yeah, for Margliff, if she's still with us, a comment for her about the transition of around 12 to 1400 BP. The latest style of painted pebble is very different from the archaic styles, and it comes in at around 7 to 800 BP. It is very much coincides with some of the things she's seeing in the Southwest.
Yes.
Cool.
So we may, the study would expand, the Pecos River style art is in a very broad context of human, existence and life and time. It's in a time frame. So there, of course, are multiple lifetimes of research available just in the collections and in the region. So, but we're excited to have been able to bring just a little bit, maybe 30 minutes of that review to the folks that are still there. I figure I'm talking to myself by now, right?
No, there's like 66 people still on here.
Oops, okay. Oh. Anyway, a good exchange. And I might, while people are still there, there's a lot of research going on. I know the climate research is being taken over by Jasmine Kidwell at Baylor, and she's going to dive into the leaf wax questions. directly from Pecos River, from Lower Pecos sites. So we've got a lot, that'll be a new generation of research, and it will be exponentially better and broader than what's come before it. So I'm excited about that. The new research, that anything going on with the ASWT project and what Charles is up to out at Big Bend. I briefly mentioned that there was maize at around 2000 that's from Spirit Cave. That's intriguing. It's just right across. It's very close to where the Lower Pecos is, and yet I don't think that it was possible to actually grow maize in the area due to the fact that the rainfall patterns aren't right. They're different from what they are in the Chihuahuan Desert to the west. And you don't have terraces that reliably you could grow maize on. They would get flushed out by floods. And that's not to say they didn't try, though I bet you they tried. They gave it a shot. So I'm looking forward to see what Jasmine Kidwell comes up with in terms of climate research. And of course, Kevin and Leslie are going to be working on more samples from this area. And there's lots to learn.
I just wanted to thank everyone for attending. And please sign up for our next month's talk. We're really glad that you stayed with us today.
Thank you. Well, goodbye.
Bye, everyone.